I'm Eileen Nalley. I work at Hawaiʻi Sea Grant, and I'm going to be sharing a bit about some work I've been doing with PAC IUS largely and NOAA's National Harmful Algae Bloom Observing Network, working to better understand ciguatera poisoning in Hawaii and the U.S.-affiliated Pacific Islands. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with ciguatera poisoning, I'll do a very brief background here. It's caused by epiphytic dinoflagellates, typically of the Gambierdiscus genus, that are found in warm, high salinity, calm waters around the world. They grow as epiphytes on macroalgae, on coral reefs. And these dinoflagellates produce toxins that build up in fish, and now we know also sometimes in invertebrates. And so they can bioaccumulate over time in lower trophic level fish like collei and surgeon fishes. They can biomagnify in higher trophic level fish. This is why people often think of ciguatera with roi or kaku, barracuda, or your ulua and things like that. And then problematically for us, when we eat those fish, the toxins are transferred to humans and can cause illness, and in some cases, even death. And I'll talk a bit more about the specific symptoms associated with that. But the impacts can be wide-ranging, and as you can see, there's a number of different stages in this process that create a lot of differences and variability in how one might be affected by ciguatera and the environmental stressors that might lead to it. And importantly, I want to highlight that I really think of ciguatera as going beyond just a human health issue, an environmental issue. It's truly a social justice issue. If we think about the fact that people around the world are affected by this disease, it's the most prevalent form of seafood poisoning in the Pacific Islands. Yet, in Hawaii and the U.S.-affiliated Pacific Islands, very little work has focused on ciguatera historically. And I would argue this is because you don't get it from eating tuna or multi-billion-dollar industry food. You don't get it from typically commercially caught fish. Typically, the people getting ciguatera are recreational and subsistence fishers participating in sharing economies. So while the effects can be catastrophic on an individual or a community scale, on a sort of traditional financial economic model scale, they're not as important. So I think that's sort of led to the situation we have now, where it's wildly understudied, underreported. And in the context of this conference, or symposium, ciguatera is also expected to increase with climate change and rising ocean temperatures. So there's sort of this thermal window where the dinoflagellates proliferate, and they don't bloom like many other harmful algae blooms traditionally, but they do certainly have a thermal range that they prefer that's expected to expand. However, whether that might exceed their thermal range in some places with warming waters as they get particularly warm on some reefs, we don't really know. And this is sort of the highlight of the talk, or sort of the motivation for the work. So to get to the point where we can answer these really interesting questions about environmental drivers, what's causing ciguatera, what's causing variability, we really need basic information on the abundance and distribution of these dinoflagellates and what's happening at sort of the first stage in that process. But historically, most work in Hawaii specifically has looked at fish or people getting sick from ciguatera. So we're kind of jumping to the end of the story without understanding what's happening at the very beginning. And so that's really where we're trying to start with this work, and to start to sort of fill in some of those gaps so we can get to these interesting questions. So a couple years ago, NOAA funded sort of a pilot project to look at knowledge from local fishers in Hawaii. So we started out with surveys and interviews, anonymous online surveys and interviews with people who had had ciguatera poisoning to better understand what was really happening, because people kept asking me about it in the context of other work I was doing looking at contaminants in fish. And then when I tried to find information for them to help answer their questions, I couldn't find very much. And so that sort of led to the effort to see what do we know, what do people know, what are people saying about ciguatera among the fishing community. And so this map highlights places where people reported in these anonymous surveys that they had ciguatera. The color and size of the point refers to the number of cases. You can see some areas like the North Shore of Kauai kind of emerged as hotspots, yet no work has been done looking at what's going on up there with ciguatera. So much of the work has focused on Oahu or the Kona coast of Hawaiʻi Island. We also found these 3 species, kole, knifejaw, and uku, were responsible for around 50% of the cases people were reporting. But most of you probably think of Roy when you think of ciguatera, right? But that's what everybody thinks about, so a lot of people don't eat Roy. So when we think about what people are actually getting sick from, it's not necessarily what we sort of often associate or study when it comes to ciguatera. So it highlighted a need for additional work, certainly. What was really interesting also is just seeing sort of what people reported, how they interpreted what they were reporting and what that really meant. And so this is sort of a range of symptoms that people report, from the highest percentage on the far left, going down from there. So weakness, numbness, tingling, cold allodynia is temperature reversal. That's sort of a hallmark symptom of ciguatera. So the symptoms can really range from like a mild flu all the way to paralysis. Somebody I interviewed was hospitalized for 4 months. People were on permanent disability, had long-term health impacts. And so there's a lot of variability in the severity of people's cases. And then I also had people telling me, oh, there were no direct impacts on my finances, but I did have to take off of work, and I did used to eat reef fish 3 times a week, and now I don't eat reef fish at all. I buy salmon from Costco. So you can imagine there's a lot of layers of complexity into even people's perception of the impacts of ciguatera on their life, both financially, but also for their health and for cultural practices, social well-being, sharing, community building, and things like that. So importantly, less than 25% of cases were reported to the state as well. So that means that we have this vast underreporting happening and very little understanding of what really is the landscape of ciguatera, and that's in Hawaii. And then when we expand that out to the rest of the Pacific Islands, it's even less understood and studied. And so that's really what led to the work with PAC IUS and the IUS Association to start developing what we're calling the Pacific Ciguatera Network. And the goal of this is basically to increase connection, collaboration, and communication throughout the Pacific to share information so that we can all work together towards management and monitoring and supporting these very regional needs that we have. So we had a kickoff meeting with partners from more than 30 organizations throughout the Pacific Islands who were all extremely interested. So as much of a problem as ciguatera is for us in Hawaii, or for people who've had it, if you talk to people in some atolls of the Marshall Islands, they won't even touch the fish because they're that scared of ciguatera. So this has massive implications for many communities around the Pacific. And so our goal is to really work together so that we're all sort of leapfrogging along the process and not gathering data that's not comparable between places so that we can really build our knowledge quickly. And to do that, we're also working on building these cross-regional connections. And so I was invited by the National Harmful Algae Bloom Observing Network to serve on a panel at SACNAS last year with different folks who do harmful algae blooms, and was connected to some colleagues from the continental US who study ciguatera poisoning in the Caribbean. So we've been working with folks from Dauphin Island Sea Lab, Woods Hole, University of Texas at Austin, University of Virgin Islands, and Florida Gulf Coast University, who are all part of this Gulf Coast and Caribbean ciguatera research consortium, as well as an NSF-funded partnerships in international research and education program. And so we've really been trying to bring in this sort of national and international expertise from ciguatera work that's done elsewhere to help inform how we're approaching the work here in the Pacific Islands, so that we're, again, just starting with the best available information and doing it in a way that's really standardized and comparable across locations. And so to do this, an example of how we're going about this is in February, we brought some of our colleagues from the continental US out to Majuro. We all met in the Marshall Islands and had a week-long workshop with the Marshall Islands Marine Resources Authority, the EPA, the Ministry of Health, and the Marshall Islands Conservation Society, where we really stepped through the basics and details of sampling and processing data, how you would do this in a lab so that we can bring together local communities with this international set of experts to build capacity. And importantly, the training was conducted in their labs so that we could really see where are the holdups in available resources and tools and try to troubleshoot through that. And for full transparency, we're going through the exact same process here in Hawaii as we try to build up our capacity locally. And so we're all able to go through this together and say, oh, okay, this is really a pinch point that's making it hard to get samples. And so for just an example of sort of how we do this, this is an infographic made by our colleagues at Woods Hole for that Marshall Islands training workshop. And basically the macroalgae are collected in these large Tupperwares. You shake them really hard to get the epiphytes off, and then you sieve them so you get the size fraction that you're interested in for the dinoflagellates. And then basically that sample can be subsampled for a number of different purposes, ranging from microscopy to molecular metabarcoding to chemical toxin analysis. And so you have lots of different sort of options for your end goal. So depending on where people are at in their capacity, lab availability, tools, equipment, they can kind of choose which portions of that make the most sense for them to try to move forward. And our future goal is really to create these governing councils with local leadership to phase out the need for this sort of external coordination and facilitation. And that's both locally and on a more regional scale. And so we're trying to work with local organizations and individuals and really try to emphasize the decentralization of this effort. And as we're trying to push this forward on this sort of regional scale, we're also trying to look inward in Hawaii and better understand what's happening locally, starting with the dinoflagellates, so that we can understand the variability in environmental drivers and work towards forecasting models and predictions and things that would be really relevant for climate change impacts. And so we've recently hired Kelsey Kuniyoshi, who is a graduate here of UH for her bachelor's and her master's, and now is applying to PhD programs here and hoping to continue some of this work moving forward. So that's super exciting, and she's really leading the charge on our local sampling efforts in tandem with what we're kind of doing in collaboration on a regional level. And we're realizing that we're starting even further back in the story than we thought or hoped. And we're really trying to just figure out which macroalgae seem to have these dinoflagellates associated with them. And in every step of the process, we're being surprised. And so we found Lingbia, for example, fish aren't really eating, but it has a lot of these Gamberdiscus on them, and there may be associations with hotspots. Elsewhere, we're actually finding these dinoflagellates and getting to the point where we can identify them. That's been a whole journey, and so it's really been much more of a slow process. We had to have someone from Woods Hole come out and help us do a training on just identifying the dinoflagellates. But we're finally getting to a point where we have a good bit of momentum, so it's really exciting to see it kind of coming together. And a big part of this work has also been trying to engage students. So as our colleagues were traveling back from Majuro back to the mainland, we had them stop here, and we did a workshop at HIMB with their community education program that was mostly students to go through the sampling process here as well and engage students here in the work. And we're working on developing these student and postgraduate fellowship programs so that people in the Pacific Islands can continue working on local fisheries needs, specifically ciguatera for this context, but in their home places. And we also had a NOAA hauling scholar this summer working on Hawaii-based ciguatera work, and Duke Pa'ane is a GES student who's going to be doing his thesis with us and is specifically interested in sea surface temperature and Gamberdiscus abundance. And so hopefully next year we have this symposium, we'll have a lot more information specifically related to climate change. And with that, I'll give a shout out to Talofa Fea, who's an undergrad student here at UH who's been working with us for the last year, who has a poster in the back, and she last summer went home to American Samoa and did a fellowship with the National Marine Sanctuary there and was really able to roll out a lot of this work in her own community. She interviewed and surveyed fishers there, did some sampling, and can tell you all about it. And she's going to stay on with us, hopefully full-time in the spring after she graduates in December, working in American Samoa on this work. With that, I'm happy to answer any questions. I think there's lots of room for collaboration, though, as we're just at the beginning.